Nutrients are absorbed primarily in the small intestine, although remember that there are some vitamins or products that are produced by bacteria that are absorbed over the lining of the large intestine. So nutrient absorption has to follow digestion because in order to get those nutrients to move across the lining, they have to be broken down. So remember that we talked about the digestion, the physiology. And so in your textbook, there is a nice breakdown about what happens at each compartment of our alimentary canal. So remember that, say, for example, the starches and disaccharides start to be broken down in the mouth by salivary amylase. And then they are also broken down in the pancreas by pancreatic amylase. And then we also have what are called brush border enzymes. And those are actually enzymes that are embedded in the plasma membrane of the cell, the plasma membrane of the microvilli. And so you'll notice that lactose is one of those, or lactase is an enzyme, that is embedded that breaks down lactose. And that would be like milk sugar. Also sucrose, that's what we take in, the table sugar is sucrose, and that gets broken down into glucose and fructose. So this is a good image to look at when you're trying to figure out how the different types of substances, nutrients are processed by the body. But here we're talking about absorption. So you'll remember that in the small intestine, we have a very large surface area. So we have these structures which are called villi. And each of these villi have capillaries, but they also have a lacteal. And so the capillaries are where water-soluble nutrients are going to be taken up. The lacteals are where we have lipids or water-insoluble nutrients. So that means that these water-insoluble nutrients are not going to be passed right into your circulatory system. They're going to go to your lymphatic system and then be filtered through the lymph nodes and then come back up and be dumped back into your circulatory system up near your neck. So these are the two primary ways that nutrients are transmitted once they have been absorbed. So let's look at the structure of the villi. So remember, this is a villus finger. Remember that it is simple columnar epithelial tissue and it is ciliated. And these cells have very tight junctions. And so these are proteins that make them impermeable to large molecules. Sometimes people talk about what is called leaky gut. And when you have leaky gut, those tight junctions, because of inflammation, they start to open up and stuff that should not get into or across that membrane start to get into the membrane. And that can make you very sick. So notice that most of the stuff has to go actually through the cell. So how does that work? Well, when we look at carbohydrates like glucose and like fructose, remember that they have to be broken down into their components. So like starch and disaccharides have to be broken down. And we see here in the monosaccharides like glucose in green and fructose in purple. I think that's the way it works. Anyway, so they actually get picked up through these protein channels. They diffuse across the surface. And sodium also gets picked up at the same time. It's called being co-transported. But notice that they then are transported into or to the capillaries. So glucose gets transported into your capillaries. That blood then gets transported to the liver. And then the liver takes out a lot of that glucose to store it as glycogen. It also, the liver is where we have the breakdown of fructose. So fructose would also be taken out by the liver. And so here you can see the mechanism. It doesn't go between the cells. It actually goes through the cells, which is fascinating. Okay. Proteins, again, big proteins generally do not go right through the cell. There is a discussion about how babies could get antibodies that are in their milk across the surface of their membrane, and that would be possibly a different type of transport of nutrients. So like whole proteins generally don't get transported. So again, they go through these channels, these protein channels that maybe you learned about in cell biology, into the inside of the cell, and then they get taken up, the amino acids get taken up by the circulatory system. Now, something very different happens with fat. So fat has to be modified. In the small intestine, we have the release of bile, which contains bile salts, and that breaks down this large fat globule into smaller, right, structures on which the enzymes could actually work. So they could actually start to break them down. So this doesn't show the whole picture because it doesn't show it being absorbed. But the fat does not have to be transported with a protein carrier, because lipids can travel right in through the cells. And so notice that the fatty acids have these micelles, which contain bile salts. They come through, and then we have these fatty acids, which actually are surrounded by protein, and the protein actually makes them water soluble. So water soluble in the lymph. So we could say that lipids specifically are transported into or through the cells, we'll put through the cells. And then they are covered in proteins and are called, weird name, I'm not sure where this name came from, chylomicrons. And these get sent into the lacteal. So the chylomicrons are what actually are transported. And so actually lipids are typically transported with the aid of proteins. Even testosterone and estrogen have proteins that bind to them when they're transported in our blood. And so the fat that is transported in our lymphatic system also has proteins that attach to it. So these would be the chylomicrons right here, and they get passed into not the capillaries, but into the lymphatic system.